Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This is, we're here at the CSIR facilities, and the topic we're going to be talking about is demolishing barriers between science and the media, making way for a new dialogue. If somebody had mentioned that this time last year, there may have been quite a few raised eyebrows, like what is that about? And I think in the last 12 months, we've come to realize how important this is in our lives and in terms of the media. My name is Willem van der Putte. I'm the Deputy Chairperson of the National Press Club. And before we continue, I've been told we need to switch over for a safety briefing. Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Quick safety briefing from the CSIR ICC. Kindly practice a physical distance of 1.5 meters away from one another, as well as our team members at all times. Please wear your masks at all times within the venue, as well as the communal areas, unless consuming food or beverages. Please make use of sanitizer stations within the venue, as well as the communal areas. Should you experience any COVID-19 symptoms, please report to the reception, whereby a temporary isolation facility will be made available to you should you not be able to self-isolate. Please remember to fill in an online COVID-19 questionnaire on a daily basis before accessing the CSIR ICC site. In the unlikely event of an emergency, an alarm will sound throughout the building. Trained responders will give instructions on evacuation. Stay calm. Take only belongings you can carry. Walk in an orderly manner, do not run. Responders will lead you to an emergency exit, then to assembly point. Please observe 1.5 meter physical distancing at all times. Restrooms are available throughout the building. Please look out for signage. As this is a public building, please do not leave your valuables unattended. Refreshments are served in biodegradable packaging to avoid contact. Beverages are served individually, including sweets in the venue. Only venues with fresh air intake are being used. Restrooms' main doors are left open to improve ventilation. Basins and urinals are demarcated to allow physical distancing. Free wireless internet access are available throughout the building. Select free CSIR ICC on your device. No password is required. For assistance, please call on any of our staff members who will contact the technician to provide support. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you very much. Before we carry on, we'd just also like from the National Press Clubs to congratulate the CSIR on their 75th anniversary and also for putting this magnificent event together along with us. Before we switch over to our panelists, I'd like to hand over to Tendani Tsedu, the Group Manager Strategic Communications for the CSIR, and he's joining us virtually.
Thank you, Bella, and good morning, colleagues. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the CSIR. We are very honored to be visiting the National Press Club today and its members. As we just mentioned, the CSIR, we are busy celebrating our 25th anniversary. And you will know that there are many other people do when you grow this old, you become more intelligent, but also you take the opportunity to look behind and see what you have achieved, what you have accomplished, and also look into what were the challenges in your life. But you also take the opportunity to look at your plans for the future, what you want to achieve going forward. And these are one of the things that we have done was to look into take an introspective look into what is it that we were lacking and what is it that we need to improve. And one of that was we needed to improve communication generally as an organization, and also we needed to improve the way we engage with the media, which is why this engagement today is very important for us, and we are very honored to host it. So you all understand the importance of the media in the countries such as South Africa, from the perspective of development and also from the perspective of democracy. And in my view, I see the media and scientists playing a very big role within the community. So the relationship between the two, for me, it comes naturally. But for some reasons, there are these barriers that we need to demolish today that keeps us apart, that keeps us not trusting each other, more so from the scientist point of view. As the CSIR, we are working very hard on a daily basis, trying to convince most of our scientists to engage openly with the media. And we think we are winning that battle. We are managing to turn most of them to be able to engage with the media and share the work that they do. Because it's not good science that ends up in the lab doesn't have any impact. And science that people don't really know about also doesn't have any impact. And what the COVID-19 has showed us was that there is a need for science stories or science-based information that people are looking for, and we should be able to provide that to them. We truly value the role of the media. We are open to engage with them. We will continue to fight and try to destroy these barriers that keep popping up from time to time, which I'm hoping that today's engagement you will really look into the practicality of how to move forward and how to totally destroy these barriers, and that today's engagement won't be just another talk shop, but that there will be a specific actions put together on how the science sector and the media can work together moving forward. One of the things we also did as part of our 75th celebration was that we had to also look into our brand, and therefore we went to a branding exercise. As you can see, where you are sitting now, that you've got a new brand that's there. But the most important part there is our positioning statement, touching lives through innovation. That is what is at the heart of our work, and we can also prove that to the public, that we are touching their life through innovation by using or by partnering with the media as the vehicle that channels or transport this information from the CSIR labs to the public. So in those few words, I would like to again once more welcome you to the CSIR and wish you the best engagement for the day. And that you will all stay safe, adhere to our COVID-19 protocols that we have set up so that all of you came in full health, and you must also live in full health. So thank you very much and enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tendani, for that introduction. I'm going to start off my left, introduce each speaker, and then they'll have 5 minutes to do their little thing. The first speaker is Mandy Smallhorn on my left here. She's the president of the South African Science Journalists Association and vice president of the World Federation of Science Journalists. Currently a freelance journalist and a science writer for more than 20 years. Mandy.
Thanks. I've been thinking about the topic, demolishing the barriers between science and the media, and thinking about what we've been through. Willem is quite correct in saying that a couple of years ago, the idea that this was a critical task we had to perform, demolishing those barriers between the media and science, would not have been as relevant as it feels now. I think that doing that, achieving that, requires several shifts in the landscape of both science. As Tendani pointed out, we need scientists to be willing to engage with the media, but it also needs shifts in the landscape of the media. One such shift requires changing both the media and the public's framing of science, I think. When I talk about what science is, I always refer to it in simple terms, as a method of inquiry, a way of asking questions about our world. I use these simple terms in part because I want to demystify the people in white lab coats carrying glass tubes or looking through microscopes or telescopes, you know, the stock images which we use in the media to illustrate science. In truth, science and scientific research is deeply embedded in our lives. It's applied in our lives. Applied science is the term they use. In so many parts of our everyday. It's a crucial component of your smartphone. You wouldn't have it without the science behind it. It's a crucial component of the heat and eat meal that you'll pick up at Woolies on the way home today, maybe. The miracle that allows you to upload a movie from Netflix, or the headache pill that you might take at the end of a stressful day. This intertwining, this embeddedness, is a truth which we've had an opportunity to learn in the last 13 to 15 months, because we became hyper-aware of the role of science as a guide and a role player in the pandemic. It was suddenly not something separate and ivory tower. It was something giving input into our day-to-day lives, into how we were living, the guidelines under which we were moving around. And the place of science in the media changed dramatically within weeks. From being that rather esoteric thing, you know, the square kilometre array, the Higgs boson particle, the Hadron Collider, the rings of Saturn, quantum physics. Suddenly science became something very nitty-gritty. And editors and features editors and so on, who would in the past have perhaps thrown in a picture of the surface of Mars as a filler somewhere on page 7 in their newspaper, suddenly had a front page that was crammed with science and quotes from researchers from Wuhan and Italy and the USA. This time last year, something began happening which I had spoken about as a science journalist and an advocate for science journalism and begged for, pleaded for many years, a shift in media consciousness that foregrounded science in the media. The reason why I've been pleading for this is because, of course, science is not just about health. It's also about rain and soil and food and wildfires and energy and technology and everything, really. I hope that foregrounding that we have seen persists. I think it will, at least a little, when it comes to health issues. It's done so before, after all, with other diseases like HIV and Ebola. In fact, we had so much coverage of HIV that we had HIV fatigue in the media at one point. And there's a lot to cover on this pandemic into the future that matters deeply to our life as a nation. How we prepare ourselves for the next pandemic is not least among those topics. By prepare, by the way, I don't just mean our healthcare systems. I also mean creating a resilient population that can face pandemics like this. The body blow this pandemic gave to our whole globe means that pandemic-related topics will be in the news for a long time. I'm not so hopeful, however, about the other issues. I think we need a concerted effort to get the media, the editors and their ilk, to understand that underpinning all their stories about politics, about crime, about sport, about business, whatever it is science topics, some of them becoming increasingly and desperately important in our lives. See our degraded and threatened water system across this country as one example. We have to stop in the media seeing science as an extra, a nice to have, something alien. It's a part of so many of our stories. Foregrounding sciencey issues like health, but also beyond it, requires another shift, making the media comfortable with science. And by that, I mean creating a familiarity, a feeling of being at home with science topics, with research and the language of science. This time last year, I was up to my eyeballs in research. I was curating a website, a web resource for science journalists around the world that was gathering together the science that about COVID-19 that was coming at us at such a rapid rate. I mean, it was like a galloping field of greyhounds racing towards you and just never stopping. Preprints and peer-reviewed papers and just thousands of them. And I was involved in trying to, as I say, curate them, make sure that people had access to the most important pieces of science, the most interesting, the trending science. We had so much to learn and understand about this virus. And at the same time, because I was doing that, I was keeping an eye on conversations that were happening online between researchers, clinicians, and science journalists all over the world. They were holding real-time conversations via Twitter mainly. And it's going to be one of the most memorable experiences of my life, because what I was doing, I was watching researchers talk to clinicians, clinicians talk to researchers. There was this live evolution of how they were thinking and what they were doing. So the researchers' hypotheses were changing as the clinicians gave them information from Italy or from New York. And at the same time, the clinicians were changing their approach to treatment in real time. I was watching this happen. It was fascinating. But at the same time, I could see a really good bunch of science journalists who were burrowing into these conversations, listening carefully, asking questions, beginning to get a clear, I'm at home with this, I've got a grasp on this, I understand this feeling around the subjects that they were tackling in COVID-19. The sort of at-home feeling that I imagine a political journalist gets when there's a political storm raging. They have the tools, they know how to tackle it, they may not understand the topic fully that's causing the storm at the moment, but they know what to do. These science journalists, I was watching them practice their craft, and I was seeing how important that sense of, I'm not frightened, I'm not intimidated, I feel comfortable with this was. I want that feeling for all journalists when they're faced with science-related topics. A feeling that you may not understand this particular topic, this particular piece of research, or this particular discipline, but you know how to go about getting your head around it. You understand the language. It doesn't frighten you. You know how to go about looking for sources, how to speak to researchers, and how to understand the jargon of science. Being at home with science and scientists will make for better, more thorough, and more substantive reporting in many, many fields. And I just want to underline that I see a future in which science subjects are going to be so critical to our reporting. They are already. Issues that we are seeing out there from Syria to Sudan to Pakistan, they are all underpinned by science concerns, things that people are researching, that we need to dig into to get a full understanding of what's going on in those subjects. I saw a shift from the science side of things, by the way, as well this year. I saw virologists and infectious disease researchers and other experts really stepping up to the plate. I'm sure all of you did around the world. The eagerness with which they sought to convey what they knew, the readiness that they showed to step out there and actually place quite a lot of trust in many cases, unprepared journalists and media. I thought that it was a very critical stepping stone for that idea of demolishing the barriers between science and the media. To achieve what I think of as science readiness in the media will take focus, commitment, and training. Training for very early career journalists, such as Zama and his team at SASTA are doing, and have been doing for years, but also on-the-job training, mentorship, and commitment from publishers and editors to understand the importance of science in their reporting. And this preparation, this science readiness, must be done before the next crisis. We need to learn from this pandemic. We knew it was coming. Talk to any of the scientists. Yesterday, I was talking to Dr. Bertie Fielding from the University of the Western Cape, and he was saying back in 2015 already, they were saying, hey, there's a new coronavirus out there, and it's going to hit us one of these days. What did we do about it? Did we even report on that as the media? We didn't even know about it. We need to be active in searching for the future that is going to come and hit us. But we also need, as the media, to prepare ourselves and our journalists for the next pandemic, the next vast crop failure that affects food prices around the world and causes something like the Arab Spring, the next massive killer wave of wildfires, a locust swarm that crosses continents, and of course, new health crises. Make sure that we're ready to tackle anything, to have the agility and the flexibility and the familiarity with science to step into these subjects. Even if they're strange to us in detail, we at least can step forward and cover them with confidence that we know what we're doing. Because these crises and others that I can't even imagine as yet are on their way, sure as nuts. By the way, the mentorship, the training, the resources, these things are all available globally and locally. As a Hallmark card might put it, if you really, really want it, you'll find it. Or you can talk to us, the Science Journalists Association in South Africa.
Thank you, Maggie. Very interesting. Our next speaker is Professor Linda Godfrey. She's the principal scientist at the CSIR and extraordinary professor at the Northwest University. She holds a PhD and holds a PhD in engineering. She manages the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap Implementation Unit on behalf of government. She lectures internationally on solid waste management in developing countries, including the social, economic, and environmental opportunities of waste within a circular economy context, and has published extensively in this field. Prof.
Thanks very much, Willem. Hopefully I'm audible. I think I just want to reiterate some of the points that I think Tendani touched on and also that Mandy has touched on as well, which is just so important. And coming from the perspective of a scientist and having had the opportunity to engage with the media over the last 20 years or so, I think the first point is really just to stress the importance of this engagement. There is this perception, as Mandy mentioned, that science is about a really, really smart people in lab coats holed up in laboratories that has absolutely no relevance for society. But if I just think now, some of the research projects that we're funding, really innovative research projects that will touch the lives of South Africans and just really relevant science. I think the other one as well is that it's important to communicate to other types of stakeholders as well. To policymakers, we've seen recently policy uptake of some of the research coming out of the National System of Innovation in South Africa, to communicate to decision makers in business around practical solutions that they can implement to more sustainable businesses, more efficient, more globally competitive businesses. And also, importantly, to potential future funders of research to continue with some of the research that is happening. So there are various types of stakeholders that we need to be communicating to. And really, really importantly is to learn as scientists how to package the research to reach those different types of stakeholders. I think at the same time, it's also important for scientists to understand that there is a time and a place to communicate, because I think that by understanding that, it helps you to understand the framing of the communication, the packaging of the communication, to really make sure that you achieve the impact that you're looking for in that communication. So what is the purpose behind the communication? I think that one of the challenges that we experience as researchers is that there is this fear to engage with the media for various reasons. I think some scientists are comfortable in doing it. And Tendani touched on the point that, we need to be training more researchers to feel more comfortable with the media. But, my sense is that if you're not comfortable, it's fine. I think there are scientists that are. And obviously there's a lot that we need to do in investing in scientists and teaching them the skills that they need to communicate. But, there's a fear that journalists might try and catch them out, whether it be in interviews or radio or television. There's a fear that their science might be miscommunicated or sensationalized in some way. I think that also scientists, after many years of working on a particular project, can feel very protective of their research, and there's a fear that the media as well will some way belittle the work that they've done or overly simplify the work that they've done. So, for me, the approach has very much been about building a rapport with journalists. I think it's really, really important to do that, and I've been fortunate to have developed that relationship with a number of journalists where there's that trust in terms of the communication and why we're communicating. I think one of the things that I'm often accused of by my CSR colleagues is that I tend to write the article for the journalists, because it's just so important for me that the message is correctly communicated. And so I suppose one of the lessons is finding that balance in terms of working with the media in terms of the communication. I think also one of the other challenges is just the practicalities of it. Just in the last month, for example, I've been approached by journalists where I've been asked, can you prepare a one-page article by lunchtime today? Or can you be on a radio show in 3 hours' time? And as much as I would like to, and as much as I would want to work with the media, there is also that it would be helpful if perhaps it was for next week. I think also at the same time, as a scientist, I've also come to appreciate that journalists work under pressure and work under deadlines, and that whole thing about, I'll get back to you next week with a response just doesn't fly. So again, there's a respect that needs to develop as well by scientists for the work that journalists do. And again, it's part of this building this rapport. But I think I've been incredibly fortunate with the journalists that I have worked with over the years. In general, it's been a good experience. I think the journalists that I have worked with have been committed to telling the story, to finding the truth in the story. They've been enthusiastic about the science and the messaging, which has been comforting as a scientist. But I think, I touched on the point about the rapport that one needs to build with journalists. And just a practical example, it was, about 3-4 years ago when we had the listeriosis outbreak in South Africa, working in the waste sector. suddenly we found huge amounts of processed meat arriving on municipal dump sites, municipal landfill sites in South Africa. And we just know the number of informal waste reclaimers that recover recyclables. And suddenly they were faced with, this food waste, and they were completely unaware that there was this outbreak. Why suddenly all this processed meat, etc., was landing up on landfill sites? And so, as a waste community, we were able to reach out to journalists that we had worked with, and I know our colleagues here will touch on the importance of indigenous languages as well in communicating. But the message to the media was, please, can you help us communicate? First of all, to households not to dispose of these processed waste streams through their normal municipal waste, to take it back to the shops where they bought it from, and also through radio to communicate potentially to informal reclaimers in their language about the importance of not actually eating this meat when they come across it. So again, just highlighting the relationships that one can build and how you can draw on those relationships in times of crisis like this for impact. And then I think the last point that I just want to touch on, and I think, Mandy spoke to the minefield of science communication that we've had during the pandemic now. And there've really been times in the last year where I've thought, thank heavens I'm not a health scientist. Because I've been following some of the discussions as well on social media, in particular Twitter, and I've just reached points of despair in terms of sometimes the lack of willingness to engage with the science, or just completely ignoring the science at times as well. And coming from the field of environmental science that I'm in, more and more we're dealing with incredibly complex issues. We're dealing with system issues. We're dealing with issues of climate change, of sustainable consumption and production, sustainable food systems, the water crisis that we're seeing now, issues of circular economy, for example. And more it's going to be important to make sure that we get the messaging right, that there is a place for science in that messaging and in the communication, and how the messaging is carried across. There was a headline I saw just this week that said one in 4 people from a particular country are unwilling to change their behavior that would impact climate change. And I thought, but surely that means that 3 in 4 are. So what is the message that we're wanting to communicate? Because I do believe that the media can play an incredibly important role in changing behavior that will help to address these big environmental issues that we're facing going forward. So I think my closing comment is just, let us continue to invest in scientists, in being able to package and communicate their research, and let's continue to invest in journalists as well to be able to engage strongly and closely with science for impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Very interesting words there. Excuse me. Our next speaker is Mia Malan, who I think almost anybody in the media industry knows who Mia Malan is. She's the founding editor-in-chief of the Becky Cesar Center for Health Journalism. She's been in the game for 25 years, an institution-building experience in legacy media, digital native publications, and has worked in newsrooms around the world. She's won over 20 African Journalism Awards, and last year won the 2020 Vodacom Journalist Award in the opinion category. And is also a former Knight International Journalism Fellow of the International Centre for Journalists and a Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism Fellow at Oxford University. And I think Mia has been at the coalface in the last 12 months, both on social media and everywhere else, informing us about what the situation is and what's happening in and around the COVID-19 pandemic. Mia, if you can come in, and she's joining us virtually.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. So at Becky Cesar, we are fortunate in the sense that we don't have to do daily news and that we have been specializing in science journalism for quite a while. But that does not mean that we haven't been overwhelmed in the COVID pandemic situation. And it also doesn't mean that we haven't found it difficult. It's been very difficult for us with workloads, but also with keeping up with the science. As Mandy has mentioned, if you've been a science journalist, maybe you are familiar with some of the concepts here, but we have not been feeling familiar with everything because the science is so new. So there are some things that COVID has really changed in our reporting. And the one is that even though we've always had a specialized audience of scientists and academics, so we've always been forced sort of to use peer-reviewed articles in our stories, our focus has really changed now. So where we previously would have done a lot of social science, say of gender-based violence or social injustice, we now do a lot more peer science. And by that, I mean, stories about how viruses mutate or how vaccines and vaccine technology works. And that also means COVID has changed how we construct our stories because the science is so heavy and hard and we want our audience to be able to digest it. So that has meant that where we previously did a lot of analysis, our analysis have sort of changed a lot to explainers because you can't analyze things for audience that may not be familiar with all the concepts. So we would do a lot of explainers that it sort of what is a mutation, because you can't do a story on how the coronavirus has mutated if you don't explain to people what is a mutation. And that has meant that we have had to expand to have more tools when we report. So instead of just doing a print story now and explain sort of, how has the coronavirus mutated, we now make graphics and put it in the stories of sort of explain in the middle of the story what is the mutation in addition to the print stuff that we do. And when we circulate it on social media, we'll use that graphic or that social media card to make it easier to understand. And we also use a lot more social media. So previously we would only have put a story on our website and then we circulate it on social media. Now we will actually release some of it just on social media. So we'll make shorter versions of the videos that we do and just put it on social media, not necessarily linked to our story. Or we will, for instance, this week we did a long thread on a timeline of, how will our vaccine rollout work. And then we worked with another organization, Media Hack, to turn that into a graphic. And we only release that graphic on social media because social media now gets so much traction. As Mandy has mentioned, science has become so much more needed and popular. So previously, I don't think we would have gotten traction if we did that, but now we can do that. And we also try to split up our stories now and make it shorter so it's more digestible. But that means with all of this fast-changing science, we rely on scientists far more than we previously did. Previously, the very specific role of scientists in our stories where we would interview you. That's it. And we would maybe send your quotes to you so that you can double check that it's accurate. But because the science is so new now, scientists are playing a much bigger role in our work to check the accuracy of it. So where we previously would only have sent quotes to scientists, we will send much larger parts of stories now because it's just so easy to get it wrong. And almost every single time that we send it, there would be stuff that would be corrected. And we are very grateful for that role, but it does mean that scientists have to allocate more time to us and have to be more patient. So this job of getting accurate science out there has become a collaborative thing, I think, between journalists and scientists. The other thing that COVID has done for us is it has given us a lot of opportunities for partnerships, not just between us and scientists, but also between us and other media organizations. So, for instance, our speciality is not creating infographics and doing data journalism, but we've been able to partner with a data journalism organization, Media Hack, that helps us to put the information that we've gathered out in a sort of a digestible data form much quicker than we would have been able to do it otherwise. And the other thing was that News from Africa, which all of you may know as a national current affairs channel in South Africa, has been really quite amazing with realizing that they have a need for science journalists, but they can't necessarily afford to appoint them. So they have partnered with us and gave us a daily slot, our journalists, to talk about COVID issues. And that partnership is now already developed in a very nice, solid partnership where we're going to work with Newsroom Africa to launch a weekly health program and science program in the second half of this year. And I think that is where pandemics can be hard, they also present a lot of chances and opportunities for partnerships. Now, the question here is, how can scientists be part of this, and how can the media have a better relationship with scientists? Now, the one thing that I think we will all recognize is that COVID changed all journalists into health journalists overnight, but that does not mean it equipped all the health or everyone to be a health journalist. And to fill that gap isn't something that the media can do alone. It's something that we really need the help of scientists. And it's also opened up opportunities for scientists to play a sort of a different role, to basically produce their own media that will be sort of like a middle way between the mainstream media and the scientists who want to get their message across. Now, by that, I mean that because of online media and because of the need for the science information, you can now publish your own stuff. So you can make your own videos on your website, and the media could use that for accurate facts for their own reports. And I think that has started to happen much more during COVID than previously. An example would be SAPRA, for instance, produced their own videos on how vaccines get registered. And I didn't see them do these sort of things previously. And that now means that you can go and, as a journalist, go and listen to this and re-listen to it. It's not just a press conference, and use it in your own reports. And if we look at international scientists, say like Anthony Fauci, his organization, the National Health Institute, has started to invest resources into producing their own videos for the public. So, for instance, you would see Anthony Fauci being interviewed by Fat Joe, a rap artist, and they would release that on YouTube. And it would, it's gone viral, and it's helped the public and the media to access what would be difficult science information in a very digestible form. And I think we, for instance, see that Professor Abdul Karim here in South Africa being on TV so many times and explain these things in very easy language as well. But it means that, as the professor has just mentioned, Professor Godfrey, that it takes a lot of time of you because where you previously could just do your work, now there's another role where you need to spend quite a bit of time on getting this information out via journalists to the public. The other thing is, I've seen many more webinars happening for journalists, training webinars. So an example of that would be the Health Policy Initiative that advocates for intellectual property rights to be shared from pharmaceutical companies for vaccines. And they have had quite great training webinars to help journalists to understand how intellectual property works and what the transfer of vaccine technology and that sort of thing is. And I think we should see more of that. And it would be great if science organizations start to invest in that. And I have also seen many more requests for Bekesisa during this time from science organizations to train them on how to work with the media. So we, for instance, doing a series of training or webinars with the Africa Health Research Institute at the moment. And that is, to me, is quite an encouraging acknowledgement of we have a bigger role to play as scientists now, and we need a bit of help on how to work with the journalists. So I think that partnership has also become stronger. And then I think there's a great argument to be made for scientists to invest in social media. You can't pretend that Twitter doesn't exist and is not a communication channel at the moment. And if you do not have time to invest in that yourself, invest resources in getting your communications person to invest in that. And I have certainly seen scientists themselves starting to use particularly Twitter more. I can think of Chris Tulio de Oliveira has started to use Twitter quite widely to spread information about genomic sequencing and stuff that we would never have seen previously. And if you look at their Twitter followers, his Twitter followers went up from nothing to 5,000 in like 2 or 3 months. And another person who started to do that is Linda Becker from UCT, from the Desmond Tutu Center. And she's also the co-lead investigator in the Sisonke trial. And she started to distribute information that way. And I think that is a very great sort of midway for scientists to start to play, because that is where many journalists get their information from at the moment. And how much better is it to get it directly from the scientists on social media than via a journalist like myself or whoever? And something that we have tried to do, and that is also an example of a partnership that developed during this pandemic, is to have training courses and host training courses in collaboration with scientists on COVID-related science issues. So an example of that would be, there is a epidemiologist that many of you might be familiar with, Matu Pai. He's based in Canada, and he's really great when it comes to breaking science down and explaining it. So last year, it was his idea to have a course for Africa-based journalists on epidemiology, because so many journalists now had to start to report on science. And we then partnered with him. He designed the course, but Bekisisa promoted it and hosted it and, got the journalists to attend it. And that was very encouraging, because the kind of journalists who applied to attend this course was not science journalists and health journalists. That was maybe a third of the applicants. It was political and business journalists. And what was so great about that is that the knowledge that they gained, it was like an epidemiology 101 course. They can now apply to other areas as well. As Mandy has mentioned, science is not just health, it's also climate change and many other things. And some of the basic health science concepts they now understand, they could potentially now use for other epidemics or other diseases that they might have to report on. And that then led to us working with a South African organization at Stellenbosch, the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare. And we last month in March presented a Vaccine Science 101 course. And of course, we as the journalists don't present it, we get the scientists to do it, but it was very, very encouraging to see how much time the center was willing to invest for free in designing a course and having calls with us, and then, doing the lectures for the journalists. And I think that is one way to try and bridge this gap of, it's not all health journalists with a background that report on this pandemic. It's many other journalists as well. And there's a great benefit of that. It's great to have people and journalists from other backgrounds who might have more political insight or more business insight when it comes to, how you procure vaccines, for instance, or, other business aspects of healthcare, and to have them involved in this where they previously would never have been involved. I think it brings a richness, but there is a responsibility then from the science world and us as health journalists to help them to be equipped to do this. So all in all, I think there is a much greater opportunity for partnerships that a pandemic brings than what we would have had otherwise. And there's such a great opportunity for us to become more familiar with scientists and scientists to become more familiar with us. But this will not happen, sadly, if both parties don't invest more resources, money, yes, and time to make this happen. But I've seen some of that happen during the pandemic, and I think the power of such partnerships and the results of it transcends the time and the resources that you have to put in it, because ultimately you get the right information out to the public. You help to address anxiety among, about issues that people might not understand, and you help to hold the government accountable for implementing policies in an effective way. But you can't do it if you don't understand science and don't get the science information out to the public so that they can use it to hold the government accountable. So, yes, more resources and time, but I think it's possible, and I think it's started to happen. Thank you.
been doing during the pandemic in informing us and trying to make it as accessible as possible in language that hacks like us can understand. Our next guest is Sibusiso Biyela, a science writer, communicator, and advocate for the decolonization of science and science communication. I saw a tweet last week that's telling how you were looking forward to being part of this discussion. And when I read your CV, I think your work and in terms of distributing information is an integral part of what we need in South Africa. So, Sibusiso, if you would give us your insights, please.
Thank you very much. My view of this topic in terms of demolishing the barriers between science and media is that I'd like to also demolish the barriers between science, the media, and society as well. Because at the end of this pipeline of science, from science to society, is people, readers, a huge amount of which are not scientists themselves, people who don't have, they might have the respect for science, but they don't have the thinking or the knowledge that comes with appreciating science for what it is. And in my experience as a science communicator, having worked with a lot of normal society people, is that a lot of people are quite smart. They are not stupid in any way. They respect science. They might not understand it as much as we would like, but they do respect it. The issue comes when we have this assumption that if we have accurate information, people would accept it. And we live in a time where you have a device in your pocket where you can find out anything you want about the world. And unfortunately, we live also in a time where a lot of people think science or scientists know everything. And so it is quite interesting to see all the commotion from last year when people were quite shocked hearing from scientists a lot of we don't knows, and we'll see what happens, or we'll try, especially with stuff like all those questions that came at the beginning of the pandemic, like does it spread in the air? Can I get infected if I sit next to someone? There's lots of many things that are basic now, a lot of issues that came with the WHO taking a long time to declare it a pandemic. And all those shifts left and right, all those uncertainties just built in a lot of people doubt in the system that if scientists don't know what they're talking about, then who am I to trust the news that is coming from that? And the issue that I see from there isn't a lack of knowledge about science. That's not the only issue. Luckily now we have a lot of information that we can give to people, a lot of accurate information. For me, what people lack isn't so much the body of knowledge that science has, but the critical thinking that comes with understanding science and scientific concepts. So it hasn't been very helpful at the beginning to just give people information that they need because there wasn't much available at the time. So for me, the biggest issue is in South Africa, having had this education system that I've gone through myself, it's really bad. Like it's quite bad, and it hasn't gotten better in the past, in the sense that I know a lot of scientific knowledge myself, having done a degree at university in physics, and also being quite interested in science myself and choosing a science stream at school. And I feel really bad for anyone who didn't take that interest. And most of what I know about science didn't come from school. It came from outside sources because I was encouraged to read at home and do other things. And all that knowledge isn't available as much in school. And with our past, with apartheid here in South Africa, a lot of us black people have this notion that science is hard and that it's not for us. So it's not surprising when scientists are being uncertain about things, or people have mistrust about science. And another thing is that I don't like it in this. I don't like it when science is made to be special, like it's been mentioned by my previous speakers. It's not a good thing for science to be special in the sense that people see it as this ivory tower thing that is unapproachable. I would like to see more science stories in the media, not under the category of science, but just a normal story. Something interesting happened, then you can read about it, right? It shouldn't be an unwelcome guest. And one way that science becomes an unwelcome guest is in settings where you speak about politics or sports or all the great things we like in South Africa. You can speak in your native language. You can speak in an indigenous African language. But then when it comes to talking about science, you have to switch. There's that code switch, which makes science an unwelcome guest. Not that the people you're speaking with don't understand English. They do. They just prefer that you continue speaking in your native tongue. And I find that problematic because I want to talk with my friends and family about science in my own language, and I don't want to alienate the topic itself. So a couple of years ago, I started writing articles in isiZulu, and one of those articles was about dinosaurs. And I thought, oh, it would be cool to talk about dinosaurs in isiZulu, until I came across the issue that, well, there's no word for dinosaur in Zulu, and other simple scientific terms as well, like fossil, DNA, evolution, millions of years, eras, and all those things that you talk about in paleontology that you don't even think twice when you're talking about it in English. Like, you can talk to someone else about dinosaurs, you don't have to spend 2 minutes explaining what a dinosaur is, right? And I found that to be problematic, and the more I looked into it, the more I found a lot of information about things like Bantu education and what we've all been through in terms of how science has been segregated for certain people and not for others. And the culmination of that is parents who will tell children that science is hard, or that the only reason they should do science is for jobs. So the scientific thinking that comes with understanding science isn't valued as much as just an opportunity, an economic opportunity to get a job, or to just understand it so that you can pass and move on to other things. And I don't like that about science, and language is one of the ways that I think that can be changed, and not just native or indigenous languages in South Africa, but just how you talk about science to people. And I think that if we're able to own science as just a part of our lives, things like the pandemic don't surprise us. We're not, the virus itself might surprise us, but the information that we're getting, or who we should trust and who we shouldn't trust, doesn't become an issue. Like, I looked at when the pandemic started last year, and looking through Twitter, a lot of conspiracy theories going around. Can't remember if I remember this saying correctly, but a lie travels across the world while the truth is putting on its shoes, and that's become much more much more of a truism today with the advent of the internet. Not the internet, I'm speaking to thousands of social media, especially on Twitter, and how conspiracy theories trend. You'll see videos of someone talking about vaccines and how dangerous they are, or anything like that. And by the time you try to Google the truth, it already has 60,000 retweets and being shared all over the place, and it won't get removed or anything like that. So the issue isn't that people are dumb. The issue isn't that people are... It's the issue is people can be bad at understanding what's misinformation and what's the truth. And the issue is, if there's uncertainty and there's someone who's quite confident in what they're saying about a certain topic, you'll look to them. And it's not that the science isn't there to dispute that. It's just that the science is accurate, but it's not talking to the issues of everyday people, the people who are supposed to do the social distancing, the people who are supposed to put on masks, the people who are supposed to make these sacrifices like working from home or having their businesses struggle. If you hear that there's a conspiracy that, the government has it for you to struggle, and that there's no coronavirus, there's no COVID-19, there's a lot of people who still believe that, right? And in my experience, it's not so much how much information you can give to people or how accurate it is. It's speaking the right language, both in clarifying your science, and this is for scientists. For us science journalists and science communicators, we're trying not to oversimplify your work. We're trying to clarify it. Right, you publish in journals and other things like that, but while speaking to other scientists and other people who understand the science, but when speaking to people in South Africa who don't have an issue understanding science, they have an issue with how science has been taught to them. It's when you understand who your audience is, you clarify the science. You're not trying to oversimplify it. And I've seen a lot of scientists in the past year trying to understand that and being more open to talking to the media, talking to ordinary people. And it took quite a long time to get that done. In my opinion, last year, but where we are right now, I think we're in a really good place. But yeah, that's the biggest thing, how you talk to people in terms of the language that you use, the clarifications that you do. And I'd just like to end off on a quote, which says, "Without literacy in the languages of the masses, science and technology cannot be culturally owned by Africans. Africans will remain mere consumers, incapable of creating competitive goods, services, and value additions in this era of globalization." And this was a quote from a social scientist called Pra, and that's basically the philosophy with which I approach how science is communicated, and I think that would go a really long way in breaking down the barriers between science and the media and society that consumes it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibusiso. That's very interesting. I think also it's one of the big challenges that the media industry faces, and also scientists, is getting the message out there in languages that everybody can understand. Challenging conspiracy theorists, because like you say, within 30 seconds it's got 60,000 retweets and it becomes the truth. And then for respected science journalists and scientists to try and debunk that is becoming harder and harder, because the weirder things are, the more people believe them. Our next speaker is Zamitola Matiwana. born and bred Eastern Cape before he moved up here to Gauteng. His passion is indigenous languages, much like Sibusisi was talking about earlier. And the role that indigenous languages can play in democratizing science in South Africa. And he's currently working for the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement, which is a business unit of the National Research Foundation. Thank you.
I think, South Africa is a wonderful place because of all of these languages. I was reflecting on this topic, earlier on when I got the invitation. I think, some of my reflection has been highlighted by Mandy. If I could just touch on them, I think in order to respond to the question, we need these shifts, One of the shifts, I think it was mentioned by Mandy, is to really foreground science journalism in the newsroom. I think that's very important. I think the other one, which is very important for me, is to really foreground science communication when it comes to the, science community, which is very important because some of the challenges, is the challenges of access, to scientists. As a journalist, if you don't have access to, to the scientists, you won't have a material, to write your story. So I'm very happy to hear from Prof. Linda, that she understands the importance of deadlines, when it comes to journalism. I think the other one that was mentioned was the issue of trust. I can hear from Linda that, I think that's one of the things that she was grappling with, earlier on, because she wanted to own, what is going to be communicated by journalists. But I think that's one of the things that we really need to address, when it comes to the relationship between scientists and the media. But I think the other one, which is the most important one for me, is the access, which leads me to the issue of language, because, as a developing country in South Africa, we have a number of our, citizens who are illiterate. I know that sometimes when we talk about science and journalism, we tend to focus too much on print, and then we forget about the broadcast, because the broadcast for me, I think it also plays a very, very important role. The program is also, funded by the Department of, Science and Innovation. They've been funding the program, since the inception of the program. We have about 32 interns, currently in the program. I think at the end of this month or next month, we will have about 42 interns in the program. In terms of the media outlets partners, the majority of our partners are in broadcast, especially radio, as I indicated earlier, the importance of radio. We also have, partners in terms of television. One of our partners is 1KZN Television in KZN and Cape Town Television in Cape Town. We also do have, print partners. We do have a Saipone newspaper, which is based in Limpopo, and Dabela newspaper is based in Limpopo as well. And then we also have, some of the, partners, in the KZN as well, who are also, print media. So for us, the program, it does, have its own challenges. And then when I look at these challenges, I think, for me, there are also opportunities. One of the major challenge, as my colleague here, fellow comrade Sibusisa has mentioned, is the issue of terminology when it comes to our own languages, So there's a, lack of, terminology, especially when it comes to scientific terms. So I think for me, I always look at this as an opportunity. And we can learn a lot, from Afrikaans, because Afrikaans is the language that was developed in this country. How it was developed, I think for us, in terms of trying to address this problem, in terms of indigenous languages, I think there are lessons that we can learn, from Afrikaans, because I think it's very important that, there is a sort of like a really, support in terms of the languages, especially when it comes to the, linguistic, departments, people who specialize in languages, because they need to help us in terms of developing new terms. For example, every year when you look at the English Oxford Dictionary, there is a new word every year. When you look at that, because there are people who are tasked to really look at what's happening during that year, which new word has come up, and then they introduce that word in terms of in the Oxford Dictionary. So these are the kind of things that we need. We need our linguistic. We need our linguistic department. I know some of them are really doing a good work. If you look at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, their department there in isiZulu is doing a really good work. If you look at some of the work that is happening in the Eastern Cape universities, University of Fort Hare, University of Rhodes, some of these graduates as well, you can see nowadays, there are more graduates who publish their work in indigenous languages. Just recently, there's a PhD, student from Rhodes who graduated, in the linguistic department. I think, he wrote his thesis in Shishona. The same thing happened, I think, last year in Northwest, where someone, produced, a PhD thesis in Setswana. The same thing also happened at Rhodes, where a student there produced the whole thesis in Xhosa. So for me, I think, these are kind of shifts that are happening. But I think there's a need to really coordinate, some of this work. Because this work is not like it's not happening, but it's scattered all over the place. And then when I think about that, I find hope that, in terms of, the terminology, it's just a current challenge. In the long term, it's going to be a problem. All we need to do, is to really, work together, with the linguist expert to really come up, with terms, so that our own languages can grow. Because every year we hear that, there is a danger of languages dying. And it is not something that is not happening. In some other countries, the languages are dying, especially if they are static and if there are no speakers. For us, I think, this is going to be a really good opportunity, for our own languages, to develop and to give them life, so that, there is no threat that one day they will die. So with those few words, I'd like to say thank you.
With me, the fact that it's the SABC, because we're so engrossed in our own lives in cities and things, whereas millions of people still live out in rural areas. And how do you get that message across to them? How do you make it simple enough so that they can understand it, the science language, without trying to confuse them, and keeping them well informed as well? We're running a little bit over time, unfortunately, but we do have to have a question and answer session. If there are questions from the floor, please stand up, say who you are, and address the question to who you think may answer it, or the panelists can decide amongst themselves who's best to answer. We should just need a mic. Where's our roving mic? Oh, there we go.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Elsevier Conradi. I am so delighted about this morning, because my first PhD I did in science communication management, and it was exactly about this topic. How do we get the science out to the general public, to the government, to the laymen out there, so that they can understand the most important things that our scientists are producing? And all the what actually bothered me is the fact that since 2005, when I got my degree, it's 16 years, and we still sit with the same problems. And I was wondering, is there not maybe a platform that can be created where we can get government who has to play an extremely important role, I think, from my perspective, so that we can actually get this movement almost from the ground, so that we don't sit 16 years from now on still with exactly the same problems. And yes, science is difficult, but there are so many ways, infographics, all those things that can be utilized to make science so much more easier to understand by even the illiterate people who cannot write and read, but with pictorial infographics type of information, we can get the message out there. But I still think that if we don't have the buy-in from government, where policies can be made, where it can be brought to even the earliest learners at school, then we're still going to sit with the same problem 16 years from now. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, now we need the mic again, please.
Run.
Oh, there you go.
Is it on? Okay. I get your frustration, but I do want to say that I think that we have moved on quite a lot. Mia was talking about all the new stuff that people have been learning to use. It's not just because of COVID, by the way, but COVID coincided with the new digital media explosion. So the possibilities, it worked very well together. But there's a whole lot of other stuff happening, and one of the things I want to mention is the conversation. The conversation.com, which is, for me, a fantastic platform for scientists to communicate their message, because it's a bunch of very senior and experienced journalists and editors who take the article that the scientist wrote and turn it into something that is human-friendly, that is accessible and understandable, and it doesn't distort the message or warp the message. It's done with the scientist so that they sign off on it. They know it's their voice, their message, their findings that are being communicated, but in a way that people find easily consumable. So that's a really important thing. I agree with you to the extent that I think that mentioning that it has to start at school. I've got a big thing about teaching critical thinking and basic skills in interrogating the world at school, and I think government has a huge responsibility for that. I'm also highly encouraged by the existence of people like Zama and Sibs who are focused on not just, as Sib said, it's not just about speaking the languages, as in, isiZulu or isiXhosa. It's also about speaking the kind of language that people can understand easily, not hiding behind jargon. And I've very often found in the past that journalists, when they speak about science, they like using the jargon because it shows that they understand the science, instead of thinking about how that is rebarbative for the audience. So that idea of using people's own languages and also using an accessible style of language, I'm very heartened to see that kind of impetus growing in our country. So yes, in some ways we're still there, but there are these burgeoning changes that are very encouraging.
Questions? Anybody else?
Zama wanted to say something. Zama.
Oh.
I think I agree with Mandy, because I think there is a shift, because some of the work that we are doing at SASTA is to really train scientists on how, on science communication. Because I think that's very important, for them as well to be really comfortable. So some of the things that you have mentioned, they are part and parcel of some of the modules, that we have, for scientists. So just recently, we published a poetry book, science poetry book, at SASTA. So those are kind of initiatives that we are running at SASTA. We also run competition, especially for young scientists, For example, we run FameLab, those are kind of a science communication competition so that scientists can begin to develop their science communication skills at a very early age. So that by the time they become a senior scientist, science communication is part and parcel of their work. They don't see science communication as an add-on. What they see is that, for me, I'm doing a very wonderful research, and in order for people to understand and know about my research, there is a need for me to communicate. So I think there is a shift, that has been happening. So, things have been changing, Yeah, so that's my contribution on that matter. Thank you.
I have a question. In the last couple of decades, everybody's been talking about the junification of newsrooms. Some of the kids in the newsroom are younger than the time I've spent in this game. And they were stretched before COVID. So, and all of a sudden, this arrived at our doorstep, and a ton of information flew out to basically youngsters who were still trying to find their feet in journalism. Most, not everybody was as fortunate like at the Bekisisa Center. So there are newsrooms around the country that are struggling to cope with all this information. From the science community, how do we get them to understand it, to put a medical report out in 400, 500, 600 words for people to understand? It's becoming increasingly difficult, isn't it?
Yes, I think it does. That's why it's very good to have platforms like the conversations, where scientists they can be able to write their own. We used to call them in the print columns, because that begins to help even the print media to pull some of the information from there. So there have been a lot of things that are happening. Conversation, Bekisisa as well. So all of these things, I think for me they are trying to address the same challenge that we are raising. Even in terms of some of the program that we are running as well, because there are also some of the plans that are in the pipeline for us. Is to really try to come up, in collaboration with some of the, journalism awards, for example, Vodacom Journalism Awards, Sanlam Journalism Awards. Some of the plans that we have, is to really begin to introduce a science and technology, category in those awards. Those are, will begin to create some incentives, for the journalist, and then, as part of those incentives, the quality as well will also improve, in terms of that, some of the plans that we have is to, we've been, engaging SANEF as well. So what Mendy was talking about here, that there is a shift in terms of editors, this is something I also experience, because as part of this program, we're also planning to expand it, to the mainstream media, where there will be a dedicated person, in the mainstream media who will be responsible, for science content. So what it does now, it lessened, some of the, the baggage, from the mainstream media, as Mia, alluded to earlier on when she was talking about the Newsroom Africa. So those are the kind of initiatives. I think we also need to be very creative in terms of dealing, with some of the challenges. But for me, I'm always hopeful that we'll find solutions. Wherever there's a problem, there's a solution. That's my belief.
While we're waiting for the mic to, there we go. Just to add to that, I think the point that Mia touched on around also making science available before journalists need it or need to go and look for it, I think is also incredibly valuable. So how do we actually package and make information available? So, I think, for example, all of the research projects that we're funding under the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap, one of the conditions of all of the grant projects is that the scientists produce a short briefing note, which is written in a way that is perhaps understandable by the general public or policymakers, decision makers, whoever it might be. And we've been fortunate that the CSR has the parliamentary office. Many of those briefing notes we've shared with the parliamentary office to share to researchers within Parliament, etc. So it's really around packaging and making the information available so that young journalists who may be thrown in the deep end don't necessarily have to go and hunt for the information, consolidate the information, but it is already available in some format or the other. And I really like the example of the videos that Mia referred to. So I think it might have triggered some ideas for me.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in practical terms, I've actually mentioned a couple of times to organizations like SANIF, for example, that they should use the skills available in this country already for mentorship. You know, when you sit with a story that has to be published in the next hour and you're not sure of yourself, to have a senior science journalist at the end of a phone, or somebody that you could just WhatsApp and say, check this, and that person can say, ask those questions, find that person. I think that we need to work together to fill this gap. Scientists, science journalists, a lot of us are freelancers now because there's no science desk, and the overstretched media,
Mia wanted to come in and say something. Mia?
But the one thing about the pandemic is, as Mandy is mentioning, there's stuff happening in terms of, how to train journalists. But the thing about a pandemic is, it didn't just coincide with the online media. A pandemic has a distinct feature that it speeds up processes. So it speeds up the rate at which partnerships happen. Not just in the media, does it even in the health sector as well, because there's such a great need for it. So one thing I've certainly seen in the media during COVID is that there are significantly more op-eds written by scientists. And yes, it's a conversation, but not just a conversation. If you just look at the Daily Maverick, or if you look at other mainstream publications, there are many more op-eds from a good thing, right? So that they make their voices heard and get accessible information out. But the other thing is, as you mentioned before, that COVID stripped many media organizations from even more money than previously. And now there's a bigger need for specialist reporters, but there's less money to afford them. So one way to get around it is to use specialist organizations to help to share the copy, essentially. And they are in the health field. South Africa is really lucky to have quite a few organizations around. It's really not just CSIR. There's Health E, there's Spotlight, there's Roundup that produces health copy. There's also View Frame that produces great stuff. And to use some of those stories, but not just use those stories, to collaborate with organizations and try and co-produce things, because that could fall that mentoring sort of aspect that Mandy has mentioned. So I do think that because of the lack of finances, the COVID pandemic has opened up a bigger space and a bigger role for donor-funded organizations. And by that I mean organizations that don't make their living of advertising like mainstream organizations, but from philanthropy, essentially, that funds. And I think there is a way to look into it to make it more collaborative, so that it's not just stories that BBC or Spotlight produces, but that there's sometimes collaborations between them and the journalists at a mainstream organization, so that there's some sort of mentoring.
Thank you, Mia. We've got a couple of questions from guys who've been listening in from the outside.
Thank you, Willem. We received about 5 questions from our online audience. I'm not sure if you'll be able to take all of them.
Well, let's go through. Let's just see.
All right. So the first question is addressed at Professor Linda Godfrey, and they ask, they say you did great work in educating the masses about recycling, and we see them in action every day. What advice would you give upcoming scientists about communicating impactful research? And then the second question is for Zamo. And they say, how did the communities receive the content dispensed in indigenous languages? Did you get the desired change? Was there a notable change or shift in behavior? And then the next one says, thank you CSIR for hosting this session. I would like to find out if academic institutions and organizations such as the NPC can also consider introducing public speaking courses for scientists so that they can be able to learn how to communicate their research in simple terms. And then the next one says, hello panel, thank you for hosting this very informative session. COVID-19 has exposed a lot of ignorance around science. I just want to find out from the panel how they see future science communication being packaged and delivered to ordinary citizens. And then, furthermore, I would like to find out why media houses do not have dedicated science journalists the same way they do with sports. I believe this could be the start of demolishing the stigma around science. Thank you.
Can I take the last one? The issue of the lack of formal science desks in the media is an issue that plagues the media around the world, and it's not just about science journalism. It's about what's happening to the media. The media is squeezed and pinched and working with less resources than ever before because a lot of their revenue has moved into online spaces. So, unfortunately, one of the first things to go was the science desks. They had, I forget the figures, but it was something like 400 science desks in the United States at the beginning of the century, and there's something like 20 now, something like that. It's a tidal wave. It's just, a complete erosion of capacity, and a lot of science journalists around the world are working on a freelance basis now, and that is one of the things that I talk about constantly, is we need to find a way to salvage those skills and build those skills in new upcoming, not just journalists, but people who are what I call media practitioners, people who are able to communicate science subjects in a very easily digestible and agile and modern way. I mean, to people who are able to use modern digital technology effectively, as Mia was mentioning. And Mia mentioned one of the ways in which I think we are going to face the future, and that is with donor-funded reporting on science, not just on health, as she says. We've got a lot of that in South Africa, and we're very lucky on that score. But we need to be doing this with other very basic sciences like waste and sanitation and that sort of thing, and climate change, agriculture, all of those kind of things are going to be critical reporting needs in the future. So yes, very, very hard question, that one. Okay.
I think one of the questions was directed at Zamekolo, yeah.
Anecdotally, I think there's been a positive.
Definitely not CSIR protocol.
It's on.
Anecdotally, there is some evidence that there has been a positive response from the communities and the community media. For example, in some of the radio stations in Limpopo, there is a radio station called Sekokuna FM. What we heard, from the station manager is that they even increased, their listenership, because what we, initially when we started, rolling out this program, we encouraged the community radio station to really start science slots. So, these science slots, it looks like, they are, contributing, positively, in terms of the listenership. So I can say that, that's what we are hearing from the station managers, from the interns. But what we have just done recently, we did an impact study just to assess, the program, since the beginning for about 3 years, 2016 until 2018. There's that study, we just finished it, so it will be interesting to see, what comes out of that study. So we will have, some really, proof, evidence that this is what, the impact, of the program is. But anecdotally, so far there's been a really positive feedback, from the listenership, committee members and the station managers.
We've got Mia that also wants to come in just to answer some of the questions.
Oops, muted.
I think you muted me, huh?
Somebody had to do it.
The question about, why don't we have science tests? Well, obviously, because it's expensive, and because specialist reporters come at a higher cost than a general reporter. But I learned how to be a health journalist because when I worked at the SABC as a young journalist, there was an international organization that gave the SABC money for health reporter, and that meant I wasn't allowed to be pulled off health stories and put on, the selection on political stories because the money had been used for that position. So one way to start to create more specialist desks at mainstream media organizations is to apply for donor funding because those positions come at a cost. But what this means is that media organizations will have to develop different skills because to apply for donor funding, you need to know who the donors are and you need to be able to speak and write proposals in a language that is very, very far removed from, the language that a journalist would use. And so there's a gap that is opened for a new sort of like skill on how to raise funds, not from advertisers, but from donors. And I also wanted to respond to how will science information be packaged in future. I firmly believe that it's no longer just going to come from the media, that science organizations are going to start to play a hybrid role where they package and they invest in skills for that. They own information and they can publish it on their websites but also circulate it on social media. And I think that is a very important role. It's not just that online makes that possible, but it's also that Professor Godfrey mentioned that if she gets a short deadline, she can't always make it. But if there's information, videos, and nicely packaged pieces available on their website, or that they circulate on social media, journalists can use that to write their stories. They may not necessarily republish it in that form, but that is the way to access it a little bit quicker. And I think if they could have information in those videos or in those pieces that they publish, that they, when they decide what to publish, to sort of like formulate it around the most common queries that they get. I think that can really play a role. And as you may have seen with press releases, when you get a general reporter who has to report on a science press release, you'll pretty much see copy and pasting. Often you'll see almost like that press release just for someone else's byline. And people talk about that. It's a good thing that they can copy and paste because it will be accurate. I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to write it, but rather have the accurate stuff. So if you can package stuff in a way that you think will work for a news organization, you increase the chance of the information being put out there accurately. And that is essentially what you want, right? You want the information to be accessible to a wider audience and you want it to be accurate. But in order to get it accurate, you're going to have to invest in appointing journalists at your own organizations, essentially. And you see it happening in South Africa. Discovery, the medical aid, has a whole media unit that are staffed by journalists who write stuff, not PR people. So I really think that is not a bad thing. That is a good thing that will play a hybrid role, that will distribute science information wider, and that will give journalists access to more accurate sources. Thank you.
I also have one. Sorry, do you want to say something, Prof?
Oh, I just wanted to respond to one of the questions.
Yes,
so if
no, absolutely, go.
Okay. I just wanted how do young scientists actually communicate more? It was one of the questions that was asked, and I find that always the passion of a scientist will always come through. It will always shine through in that they want to tell the story. They want to tell the work that they're doing, and how do we give them a platform to be able to do that? I can't recall if it was Mandy or Mia who mentioned that we're seeing a lot of scientists move onto social media like Twitter. I moved onto that platform a couple of years ago, and I've found it's been a wonderful platform to engage, not only with other scientists, with journalists, but also with the general public. But obviously it is a minefield to navigate. There are dangers to it as well, and I think as young scientists, one has to be very careful on platforms like that. There's always a risk of prematurely sharing intellectual property. So, just again to be cautious of what is being communicated, and also that you're representing a brand, you're representing your university, or you're representing a science council, and again, one has to be very careful in terms of, is it opinion coming through, is it science coming through? And I always on Twitter, I always try to remain very neutral in terms of the information that I communicate, that despite having strong opinions about something, that's not the platform to have them. So it is a difficult space for young scientists to try and navigate, but I think certainly as organizations, we need to find more platforms for them to have a voice and to share the passion that they have about the research that they're doing.
My question is, and it's probably aimed more at Mia, are we not in danger of having COVID fatigue? It's every single day, it's in every newspaper, it's in every news report, it's on television, it's on radio, it's on social media. Sorry?
There's a question here.
Oh, okay. Are we not at a point where, how do we keep it interesting? Because people are now basically saying enough already. We're just being constantly bombarded with COVID thing, and most of it is negative.
Sorry, I can say not only just COVID, but I mean things like climate change, the energy crisis. I think people just reach a point of fatigue, and how do we navigate that?
For me, I think with COVID fatigue, luckily, I don't think we're at that point, or we'll get to that point anytime soon. There's always something new happening with COVID every day, especially here in South Africa now when it comes to all these new variants going around. But especially with the work that Big CSIR is doing. I did see the Twitter thread of the infographic showing all the, putting together the information about vaccine distribution, and it's something that's still going to be very novel, very new in the next coming 2 years or so. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of dislodge that fatigue that might come from COVID news all the time. But luckily, I don't think we've reached that point yet. But it would be interesting to see how we can apply that new media and those new strategies when it comes to things like climate change, because it isn't going away. It's not as much in the news right now, but it isn't going away anytime soon. So yeah, I'm excited for what's happening in the future of science journalism, science communication in that sense with all this new media, but I don't think there's fatigue much in that sense. There's always new information and always new ways to communicate it.
Mia wanted to respond as well.
There's something to be said if you compare, for instance, HIV and COVID, that COVID, the perception of COVID is different from HIV, that everyone feels they're equally affected by COVID, and with HIV that was a little bit different. However, many people spoke of HIV fatigue, for instance, with our HIV pandemic, and that there were too many stories and people stopped reading them. But honestly, I will also not read a COVID or a HIV story or whichever story there is if it's not framed in a way that appeals to me. I don't think there's any need to read a science story in the media just because it's science. It's our job to make it interesting. And when I looked at our online metrics at on HIV stories at CSIR, the interesting thing over the past 7 years for our entire existence is that HIV stories were the most read. They were always one of the 3 subjects that were most read, including, for instance, gender-based violence stories that you would also think is overreported, or we get so much of it in the media. And the difference was if you frame it in a way that makes people understand how this will impact in their lives. So, for instance, when it comes to HIV, to frame it in a way that you help people to understand it's not just people who are HIV positive who are affected by this. This is how you will be affected by it. Then you get readers. So it's all about how you frame it and the sort of like amount of skill you put into it. So my argument would be for science journalism and COVID for people not to become fatigued. The solution is to invest in the skills level of journalists in general in that. And by that, I definitely don't only mean science knowledge. I mean storytelling skills when it comes to science. Because just because a story has accurate science information in it doesn't mean anyone will read it or that anyone has to read it. They don't. If it's not told with a skillful storytelling skill, then that science knowledge will all go lost.
Thank you, Mia. There was, yeah.
Sorry, I think also is that there's sometimes a frustration from scientists that journalists chase the next big topic and kind of move on very quickly from issues. And I know, for example, a lot of scientists were frustrated with the sudden shift away from the climate impact to suddenly marine plastic pollution, for example. And suddenly that became the latest hot topic to discuss, where climate was a bigger issue, a more systemic issue that was facing us. So I think as well there needs to be that appreciation that the news cycle changes and journalists are looking for the next big thing. But again, I suppose it comes back to the issue of how we package our communication for impact and making sure that the science is still being communicated because the problem is still there. You need a mic.
Yeah, I think there are two things here. Agree totally with Mia on storytelling. It is the major thing. Once you have a handle on the science, once you're familiar with and at home with research and talking to scientists, your storytelling skills are what will make it accessible to the public. The other thing I just want to pick up on is what you say about systemic. You've used that term a few times, and I think that's one of the things that we as storytellers need to wrap our heads around, is that there's a lot of stuff, it's not just jumping from one big story to another. Each big story melds with other, has connections and links with the previous big story and the next big story and the big story on the side. We need to start understanding the complexity of what's going on in our world.
Do we have a final question from the floor, and then we'll wrap it up?
My name is Osama Krea, and I was recently involved in the fighting a fire which was fake news by 5G and the connection between 5G and COVID. And it was a number of things that happened. Some of the fake news was connecting that there's no COVID, but it is radio waves from 5G that was impacting people. And the other one was, even they were releasing electronic circuits which could be injected through the vaccinations that happen. So what I am looking to the future. Some of you have said there's going to be an infocalypse. I just recently got to read one of these books which came out recently, that such fake news will be even more deep fake news that is coming out, and it's going to eclipse the truth around the science. So how does mass media and science can work together to relinquish this? I understand also the question of languages. Indigenous languages should be there, because when I was explaining about 5G and COVID, I really wanted to speak the languages of the local population, but I couldn't sometimes. So that's also something that we need to learn about. Thank you.
I sympathize. I've spent a lot of the last 12 months fighting the infodemic fires online myself. And I would just go back to what I said earlier. Critical thinking, critical analysis has got to start to be taught in our schools. That's where we have to start. If any of you have seen the recent stories coming out of Finland, what they've done with their education system to teach children how to ask questions about information online, any information, is just brilliant, and I would love to see that kind of program implemented right around the world. The other, just one thing that I would say is that what I have learned in several years of fighting infodemic wars around climate change, and this last year of fighting the battle around the fake information with COVID, is that you keep measured, you keep neutral as possible. You try to understand the emotions and feelings that the person is conveying and acknowledge them, and you do not fight. You say the truth and you acknowledge what the other person is saying. I understand that you think that 5G might be causing this. I'd just like to point out, I have had far more success, seldom with the actual person that I was fighting with, but with a lot of people around there who would then post a comment saying, thanks for that info, I didn't realize X. It's a hard job because there are moments where you want to scream. But we are fighting a retrograde war, if I can use that term. I'm not sure it's quite right. If what we're doing is fighting the infodemic, the misinformation as it comes up, as we are doing at present, we need to teach people how to ask questions. And I think that there's plenty of room for critical thinking courses for adults. I'm sure that people would be interested in learning how to think for themselves, how to interrogate info for themselves. But that's just my input.
Thanks, Mandy. I think that about wraps it up. We are I'm just going to ask each participant to give us a minute or two just to wrap up for their point of view, and then we'll call it a day. Mandy, if you'll start.
Am I? Yes, okay. This has been a very exciting time for the nexus between media and science. It has, as Mia says, turbocharged everything. Everything has speeded up, and one of the things that's speeded up and intensified is that connection between media and science. For good and for bad. There have been bad things in this last year. I have been ignoring them today, but I want to focus on the positive. I want to say that a lot of what has happened in the last year has held really positive signals for the future, and I think that we need to actually think about those things and build on them, consciously build on them, try to think of ways that we can take these little seeds of hope into the future.
Professor.
I think for me there were three sort of points that really stood out. I think the first one is around partnerships between scientists and the media, and just, we can't underestimate how important that is both now and going forward. The second one is around communicating for impact in whatever format that might take. So it speaks to the issue around indigenous languages, how we package the information, the media that we use, that we're using appropriate media to reach our stakeholders as well. And I think the third point that came out for me today was really just the call for investment. Call for investment in scientists, in building their communication skills, and the call for investment in journalists as well to be able to communicate the science. Thank you.
Thank you. Mia?
Should the main skill for me to invest in the case of both scientists and journalists when it comes to science, is a storytelling skill. How we frame information, because it is harder to tell a science story than a political story, in the sense that political stories that we mostly see on the front pages or home pages has a very strong news value in it, and that's controversy. Everyone wants to read about, the controversy around politician. But with science, we're dealing with something that people are not that familiar with, and they don't find that appealing. So if we can strengthen both the storytelling skills of scientists and of journalists who report on science, we will be able to make that information more prominent and be able to make it more accessible. So if there's one skill for me to invest in, it's not just for journalists, also for scientists, how they tell their stories. This is the thing that we must up, basically, and that's what will make the stories more powerful.
Thank you. Sibusiso.
For me, the biggest takeaway would be finding out what people know about a scientific topic. You look at normal people. Do they know things? What do they know? Let's find out. And why use that information to then speak to the right audiences based on the information that they have or that they don't have. Like Mia was saying, it's a storytelling skill that each journalist needs to have in order to communicate a scientific story. It doesn't have to be only breaking news. In a feature, you can talk about research that's months old, but be able to contextualize it in a way that people can find it interesting. You chose to write that story because you care about it. How can you transfer that interest to get other people to care about it? And that takes a lot of skill. And for me, one way to get people to care about a certain topic or a scientific topic is to write about it in their own indigenous language. I've had a lot of people who've read stories, science stories that I've written in isiZulu, who wouldn't have read it in otherwise. But now that it's been written in their own language, even if they do understand it in English, it becomes more culturally more better as cultural ownership for them to care about it. So I think that's one of the ways that we can get people to care about a scientific topic and demolish that barrier between the science itself and the media and society.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So, Kolo.
I think for me, it's going to be very important to continue with this momentum, especially when I look at the scientists, being willing to communicate their work, and I look at, in terms of journalism as well. There's more space, for this kind of articles and research. I think for me, it's going to be very important, going forward, to continue with that. And not go back, to where we were before, because I think, as we have shared here, there will be more, pandemic, that are coming. So I think, this should be a wake-up call, for both for scientists and for the media, in terms of, doing this kind of work. When I look at the program, and look at some of the former interns who were part of the program, it gives me hope, because I look at them, I see the interest. On one level, when they come to the program, some of them, they don't really know about science journalism. It's something new for them, because it's something, that they're not even taught, at universities. Maybe this is going to be another wake-up call, for universities to have a really specialization in terms of offering their courses to, students, and one of them could be science journalism, because in South Africa, there's only one institution that I'm aware of, which is the Stellenbosch University, which offers, science journalism, not even in undergrad as well, in postgrad. So when you do your honors and your master's or PhD, you can specialize in science journalism. But I think for me, we need to go, to the basics, undergrad, at least, by the time they leave, the higher education, they understand, this bit. Even, the scientists as well, I think, there is a bit of work that has been happening, in some universities in terms of really introducing science communication. So I think, with those two, for me, the future looks bright. So when I look at the program, some of our former interns, some of them have gone, just started their own initiative. The first one, started Science for Ubuntu, where, he produces, a newspaper, produces, content in Sepedi and other languages. The other one is really, involved in science education. She started, brainwaves development initiative. Just recently, there are some 2 interns who have also started their own initiative, Science for, Scifunza. So for me, when I look at that, it gives me hope, for science journalism and science communication, in South Africa.
Thank you very much. I know we've run a bit over time, but I think this is an important topic, and I'd like to perhaps revisit it again next year, see how much, how we've improved or not, and hopefully we won't have to social distance at that stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Special word of welcome, special word of thanks to our guests, our panelists, for making the time in their busy schedules to join us. and also to the CSIR for providing us with this facility. And keep your eye out on the National Press Club social media sites for future events similar to this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.